Hey, welcome back. So, the topic of this mini lecture is America in the 1950s. And there's a lot to understand when it comes to life in America in the 1950s. It's a complex topic. So, we're going to talk about five things that you need to know as you go to research and learn more about what life was like in America at that time. So, let's dig in. First thing, post-war legacies and Korea. So, the first few years of America's 1950s, of course, doesn't really reflect for every American the iconic stereotyped aspects of the 50s that we might read about in textbooks, that we might see in movies or TV shows, or that maybe a grandparent or something like that talks to us about. For many Americans in 1950, 51, 52, there's still some aspect of connection to World War II, post-war recovery, connections to families living in Europe, questions of children and adoption and orphanages and the Holocaust, right? All of that. To say nothing of the coming Cold War, or perhaps let's say you have a young son and he is 18 or 19 and it's 1950, and so he joins the army and winds up being deployed to Korea and is fighting in the Korean War. So it's not exactly that peaceful for every American, right? There are still these continued legacies, continued things going on, and of course the Cold War as well is a big part of this. Secondly, civil rights. Again, the uber stable, the uber peaceful sort of image of the 1950s, again, is something that only certain Americans are able to benefit from. So, much of the discussions of civil rights that we see played out in the streets, more so in the 1960s, are happening as well in the 1950s. This is the era of the Brown versus Board of Education cases. This is the era of the Montgomery bus boycotts. This is the era of Dr. King coming to prominence. So there was quite a lot going on when it comes to civil rights, both in the American South and around the country. But we tend, of course, to sort of, for some reason, place that in the 60s as opposed to happening in the 50s. All right, third, suburbia. Yeah, I know, suburbia. It's suburbia. So, the post-war era in America, of course, is a time period in which you had a generation of individuals that had lived through the Great Depression, that had endured the Second World War, and had not really had a lot of single-family home construction beginning. So once the war was over, with greater access to things like VA home loans, with things like being able to write off the interest in your mortgage, and property tax, writing all that property tax stuff off in the tax code, getting the tax code changed, having better infrastructure and connection to cities, you're going to start to see the rise of suburbs all over the country. But, although there are positives certainly to that, we need to, of course, remember that much of this is also a discussion of race, that the phrase white flight is particularly apt when thinking about this. All right, fourth, culture change. So there are different kinds of technological innovations that become more mainstream in the 1950s that will contribute directly to changes in daily American cultural life. So outside of transformations of kitchens, to be certain, things like television are absolutely going to transform how Americans consume entertainment, how Americans consume their news, how Americans even in terms of food, how they process food around one another, right? The concept of the TV dinner, right? This is the kind of thing that is transforming American culture in the 1950s, amongst many others. Fifth, legacy. What we today in the 21st century think of the 1950s is in some ways vastly different than what the 1950s was for those who lived in the 1950s. We usually tend to, within public culture and in pop culture, primarily tend to have a constructed stereotype of the 1950s as a golden age, as a time period in which everything was good in America. And while it may have been good for some, we need to recognize, of course, that it was not good for all Americans, and that, of course, we were sowing seeds for conflicts to come. Thank you.